I can't leave my mother alone, I'm worried about my father. Please, can you drive? Take us to the hospital. For a moment, Bob just stared at me, but then he said, all right, and started getting ready. Thank you. I quickly got ready too, and we headed to the hospital in Bob's car. As we drove into the woods and went a bit further, suddenly Bob stopped the car. Something seems off with the car. I'm sorry, but can you get out and check the front tire? I did as he asked, getting out of the car and shutting the passenger door behind me. Suddenly, wait, what are you doing? Bob started the car without letting me back in. He pulled the car over to the opposite lane, hurriedly approached me, and threw my bag at me through the open window. That's for waking me up in the middle of the night. Bob smirked and said that, then drove off, disappearing from sight in no time. 2 hours later, I arrived at the hospital to find a critically injured Bob. My name is Catherine Thompson, 24 years old. A housewife. After graduating from college, I joined a major corporation, but I resigned after marrying a senior I met there, Bob. Bob was handsome, intelligent, an all-around athlete, and every girl's dream man. I fell head over heels for Bob the moment I saw him during a training session he led shortly after I joined the company. Like other female coworkers, I would say, wouldn't it be amazing to be his girlfriend? Back then, my feelings were more like a fan's adoration for a celebrity. The mere excitement of spotting Bob in the office or getting assigned to a task where I'd interact with him was thrilling. Then, out of the blue, Bob approached me after I was assigned to the administrative department. It was work-related, but I was ecstatic that he remembered my name and specifically asked for Catherine. That day, my colleagues kept teasing me, and I felt like I was walking on air. After that, for some reason, Bob started talking to me more often. Before I knew it, we were dating, and soon after, we were married. I had adored Bob to the heavens, but I still always wondered why he had chosen me. When he proposed, I asked him, Bob, why did you choose me? And he smiled and replied, because you loved me the most. I was both embarrassed and overjoyed to hear that. I felt validated. I believed he recognized the depth of my love and accepted it. But the reason Bob gave me after our marriage was a bit different. He said, I married you because you were my #1 fan. In other words, you knew best how awesome I am. You made the right choice. It felt off. It seemed similar, yet different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. But as time went on, that uneasy feeling took a solid shape, and I found myself trapped. Had I realized what this discomfort was about sooner, I wouldn't have suffered as much. Bob was, by all accounts, perfect. As long as you didn't upset him. After we got married and started living together, I found that Bob became more critical towards me. For instance, over minor things like overcooking the breakfast eggs until the yolk was too hard, or not ironing his white shirt to his liking. Sometimes, he'd suddenly quiz me on complicated economic or societal issues and chastise me for not having a satisfactory answer. He didn't like how I woke him up in the morning, or if I didn't respond to his messages immediately, or if the coffee was too weak, or if a strand of hair was in the sink. Bob would point out every little detail, never raising his voice, but always speaking to me slowly and deliberately, as if making sure I'd understand. Listen, he'd say, I'm telling you this for your own good. So you can be a wife that's fit for me, and not embarrass yourself in front of others. If you just do as I say, you won't go wrong. This would continue until I'd respond with, yes, I understand. I'm sorry, I was wrong. Once he felt I genuinely regretted my actions, he'd say, okay, just be careful next time. I found myself constantly walking on eggshells. Day and night, I watched Bob's expressions, kept the house immaculate, and served the dishes perfectly without a single flaw. The only thing on my mind was to avoid being scolded, that was all. Yet, as I grew more weary, Bob would comment, you know, Catherine, looks do matter. Lately, you look so tired all the time. What would people think? You should always look your best as my wife. He'd then insist on buying me expensive clothes and makeup or send me to salons and spas. Bob was well off, so ironically, the only thing I didn't need to worry about was money. I also strained my nerves to enhance my appearance as he ordered, and as a result, people around me would say things like this. Catherine, you have such a wonderful husband. I'm so envious. I wish I could have married someone like Bob. Oh, how I wish I could trade places with you. I probably would have said the same thing if I saw it from their perspective. But the reality was hell. If it was possible, I wished someone would switch places with me. Desperately following Bob's orders, before I knew it, 2 years had passed. Underneath my smiling facade, I was slowly losing myself. Then, an incident occurred. Late one night, my smartphone rang, pulling me from my momentary dream world back to reality. I quickly grabbed my phone, checking on Bob, who was sleeping next to me. He seemed to have woken up and turned over in bed, looking irritated. The call was from my mom. "Hello, what's going on?" "Oh, Catherine, your father." Mom was calling from the hospital. My dad had a heart attack and was undergoing surgery. "What? Dad?" I could hear my mom crying on the other end. "Okay, I got it, I'm on my way." I hung up and turned to Bob. "What's the matter at this hour?" The clock was ticking past 1 a.m. "I'm sorry, but..." I explained the situation to Bob. "I need to go to the hospital. Can you drive me there?" Bob stared at me silently. It was a critical situation for my father. Surely, even Bob would agree to drive. Though I had a driver's license, I wasn't allowed to drive Bob's car. "I can't leave my mom alone. I'm worried about Dad. Can you drive? Please, take me to the hospital." Bob continued to stare at me for a while, then finally said, "All right," and began to get dressed. "Thank you." I quickly got ready, and we headed to the hospital in Bob's car. The hospital was about 7 to 8 miles away, and it would take roughly 10 to 15 minutes by car. The main road leads straight to the hospital. However, Bob took a detour onto a side road. "It's the middle of the night. This way is faster." "Is it?" I was grateful that Bob was trying to get me there as quickly as possible. Even though he's always tough, he truly cares for me. That's what I believed. After driving on the side road for a while, we entered a forested area. I recalled him mentioning that this route was more scenic during our drives. Suddenly, Bob stopped the car. "The car seems to be acting up. Can you check the front tire for me?" I got out as he asked and closed the passenger door. But then, what the? Bob started the car without me in it. The car moved a short distance forward, then reversed, turned around, and came back to where I was standing, looking stunned. "I have an important presentation tomorrow. And now, I've been woken up at this ungodly hour." Bob parked on the opposite lane, came rushing towards me, and threw my bag at me through the open window. "This is your punishment for waking me up in the middle of the night." Bob sneered in a creepy manner and said that. He then drove off in the original direction, and in a blink of an eye, he was out of sight. The location was inside a not-so-deep forest, and the time was nearing 2 a.m. Normally, one would feel helpless and even cry in such a situation, but I somehow felt relieved. In the pitch-black forest, I kept walking straight towards the hospital. A distance of about 6 miles, all I could think about was to reach my parents as quickly as possible. I couldn't care less about Bob's angry face. I wouldn't mind if I never saw him again. Back then, when he threw that bag at me, I almost broke down in tears, wondering why he would do such a thing. Had I messed up again? Did I upset Bob? I should apologize quickly. But I couldn't think of what to apologize for. What on earth did I do? However, in my confusion, Bob gave me the answer. It's punishment for waking me up in the middle of the night. If I had woken up Bob for some trivial reason, then it was my fault. But what if my father-in-law is in a critical condition, undergoing emergency surgery? And my mother-in-law is anxiously waiting for the surgery to end at the hospital. Bob probably doesn't care about how I feel, wanting to be with them as soon as possible. His work tomorrow must be more important to him than anything else. Even if he didn't care about my feelings or my parents, he could have just told me to go to the hospital alone. Instead, he pretended to drive me to the hospital, then lied and left me stranded in the dark forest. Such actions are beyond normal. It was a rude awakening for me. When I first saw Bob, I imagined him as a prince from a fairy tale, and I felt like I was living that dream by marrying him. But that dream turned out to be a nightmare. The real-life prince was nothing but a selfish person. It was all about him, and he even admitted the reason he married me was that I was his biggest admirer. In other words, he chose the easiest person to manipulate. All just to satisfy his ego. I thought I was loved and chosen by Bob, and tried my hardest to be a good wife to him, but now I don't care anymore. In that forest, I found my freedom. I can't go back to that cage anymore, and I have no intention to. What did I even find appealing in such a superficial person, who doesn't even seem human? While I was walking hastily through the forest, these were the thoughts running through my mind. After about 2 hours of walking, I finally reached the hospital. When I arrived at the hospital, I informed them at the emergency entrance that my father was brought in by ambulance and was undergoing surgery. The security guard at the reception checked the name I provided, and then asked me to sign in on the visitors list. Once done, he handed me a visitor's badge. I wore the badge around my neck and hurried to the central operation room where my mom was waiting. The only sound echoing in the dimly lit corridor was the click-clack of my heels. 2 hours have passed since then. I wonder how my dad is and how my mom is holding up. Naturally, I quickened my pace. The exhaustion from the long walk was nowhere to be felt. After turning a few corners, I could see my mom sitting under a dim light on a sofa. "Mom! Catherine!" As I called out to her, she looked up with tears streaming down her face. I got a sinking feeling in my chest. Is something wrong with Dad? I sat down next to her on the sofa, and she said, No, I just felt relieved seeing your face. Your dad is still in surgery." "You startled me." I felt a rush of blood from my heart and all my strength drained away. After waiting a bit longer, the lights in the operating room finally went off. We were informed by the surgeon that the operation was successful. It would take some time for his condition to stabilize, but for now, the danger had passed. My mother and I shed tears of relief together. My father was taken to the ICU on a stretcher. He's still asleep, but I was truly relieved to see his face, resting peacefully. Together with my mother, we followed to the ICU and watched over him as he was transferred to his bed. Now, there's nothing more we can do. We're just waiting for Dad to wake up and recover. I need to make sure Mom gets some rest. The 2 hours before I arrived must have been so lonely for her. Thinking about it made me angry at Bob. I took Mom to the vending machine area and bought her a warm tea. "Here, drink this to calm down." "Thank you." My mother opened a can of coffee and took a sip, seeming to finally calm down. Seeing her relaxed made me feel better too. As we sat in the coffee area before dawn, a nurse approached us. "Excuse me, are you Catherine Thompson, wife of Bob Thompson?" "Oh, yes, that's me." The nurse had seen the name I filled out in the visitor's book and wondered if it might be me. "Last night, around 2 a.m., your husband was brought in by ambulance." "What?" "We tried contacting the number your husband provided multiple times, but we couldn't reach you." I hurriedly took out my phone from my bag. When I got in the car, I had muted it, thinking I'd be at the hospital shortly. I remembered setting it that way, not wanting to waste any time adjusting settings when I got to the hospital. I saw several missed calls from an unknown number, which turned out to be this hospital's. Bob must have thought that I wouldn't go to the hospital and would just follow him home. So he provided both our home and my mobile number. He probably never imagined that I, left alone in the woods in the middle of the night, would walk over 6 miles to the hospital. I explained that my father was also being treated here, apologized for missing the calls, and inquired about Bob's condition. Apparently, after leaving me behind, Bob had an accident on his way home. He's alive, but both his legs are broken and he needs surgery. That's why they had been trying to reach me. I asked my mother to wait while I went to see Bob. It's quite something, having both your husband and father in here at the same time. The nurse said that to me with a sympathetic look, but I only felt sorry for my father. I couldn't care less about what happens to Bob. Of course, I have no intention of taking care of him. However, there's no need to say such things to someone who doesn't know the situation, so I just smiled vaguely. By some stroke of luck, Bob was having surgery in the operating room next to my father's, and he was in a private room near the ICU. There was a nameplate at the room entrance that read Mr. Bob Thompson. It's the best private room, and apparently, it was Bob's request. I entered the room with the nurse who had shown me the way. Bob was suspended with both legs immobilized, looking utterly pitiable. As he tried to speak to me, he realized I wasn't alone and said, "I'm sorry for putting you through this, especially with your father in such a state. I'm glad you came." "Nurse, I apologize for the trouble," with a forced smile. When the nurse left, and we were alone, Bob's face took on that lecturing look he always has. "Where the hell have you been? Why didn't you answer the phone right away?" "I've been stuck here, struggling." "Tell me where you've been," he demanded in an accusatory tone. "Where do you think? You told me my father had surgery, right?" Obviously, I was at the hospital. Bob looked genuinely shocked by my response. "What's with that tone? Haven't I always told you to speak politely and gracefully? I won't tolerate such language," he chastised, quickly regaining his composure. He still seemed to think he had the upper hand. "Why should I be so polite to you? To someone who deceived me and left me in a forest in the middle of the night? I don't feel the need to show such consideration." "What did you say?" Bob glared at me, saying, "Is that how you address your master?" in a calm yet restrained voice full of anger. "Master, I see." He's always thought of himself that way. His attitude wasn't that of a husband to a wife, but of a master to a servant. But I'm not a servant anymore. I reclaimed myself in that forest. I confidently retorted. "I don't have a master. I'm a free person." Seeing my firm stance, Bob's face contorted in visible anger. "Is that what someone who's been taken care of should say? Well, is that what someone who's been cared for should say?" "What?" "Ah." Perhaps shocked by my words, Bob jerked, causing pain in his immobilized legs and letting out a cry of pain. I coldly looked down on Bob, with his fixed legs, unable to do anything, his face twisted in pain and drenched in sweat. "Guess you got what was coming to you," I said, a chuckle naturally following my words. I laughed, and Bob cried. The roles had reversed. The thought made me laugh even harder. "What's so funny? It's all your fault I'm in this mess. Don't you feel guilty?" Bob asked tearfully, but still defiant. "My fault? No, I think it's someone who left his wife in a forest and hurried home." "Serves you right," I countered. Bob looked at me in disbelief, seemingly a mix of shock and fear in his eyes. His wife, who had always been obedient and looked up to him with admiration, was now confronting him with cold words and glances, as if a stranger. He looked disturbed, his eyes darting around. I realized he was just a small, insignificant man. I felt ashamed for having feared and acted so subserviently to this man for so long. "We should break up," I spoke firmly. "I don't see any point in being married to you anymore. I'll wait until you're discharged from the hospital, so please prepare yourself in the meantime. I'll pack up our stuff at home." "Don't be ridiculous. I'm never gonna leave you. Do you realize how much time and effort I've put into this relationship?" Bob winced in pain as he moved. He became silent, tears distorting his face. "Do you have anything else to say? If you do, now's the time." "What will it be?" Despite my words, Bob just continued to cry, unable to respond. "Nothing, then? All right, I have to go care for my father. Take care and goodbye." I left the room, leaving Bob groaning in pain. My father woke up later that day. Holding hands with my mother, tears of joy streamed down our faces. Although it would take time for him to be discharged from the ICU and be mobile, it was a relief to know he was stable. I returned to my family home with my mom and shared my decision to divorce Bob. My mother was initially shocked, but after hearing my side of the story, she nodded in silence and welcomed me back home. She never imagined that her daughter, who she believed was living happily, was being treated so poorly. I never told my parents the truth, trying to present a facade of a happy marriage. I even tried to convince myself that I was a happy wife. I cried at my mother's understanding and for making them worry. I wept and wept until I began preparations for the next step. First, I started looking for a lawyer experienced in divorce cases. This was surprisingly easy, because a friend of mine worked at a law firm. I met with a few lawyers and decided on a female attorney who has assisted many women like me suffering from their husband's emotional abuse. I gained an experienced and powerful ally. Just when Bob was in the hospital, I organized my belongings and prepared to leave the house. The challenge was to prove Bob's fault, but surprisingly, this was easily settled. When Bob had an accident and was questioned by the police, he told them, "I had an accident on my way back from dropping off my wife at the hospital, where she wanted to be with her father who was being operated on after an emergency." However, his story seemed off. After all, I arrived at the hospital 2 hours after Bob's accident. When asked where he was and what he was doing during that time, I honestly told them everything, including being abandoned in the forest late at night. At first, the police were just shocked, but as they listened, they began to suspect it was malicious abandonment. Many people, not just the police but also those involved with insurance, his company, and others, eventually found out the truth. Every time, Bob kept making mistakes, and I'm grateful for that. In this way, I was able to prove how much Bob had belittled, neglected, and hurt me during our 2-year marriage. He was deemed at fault due to emotional abuse. Though it was a short marriage of only 2 years and I never had to worry about finances, I was able to secure a satisfactory amount in alimony and divorced Bob. After the divorce, I returned to my family home and took care of my father for a while. Fortunately, my father's recovery was smoother than expected, and he seems to be getting back to his regular life without any lingering effects. My father's workplace has told him he can return after a brief hiatus, and he's deeply grateful for that. Luckily, I got a job at the law firm that assisted me during my divorce. A friend of mine got married and was moving because of her husband's job. Thanks to my friend's recommendation and the lawyer who had seen my true nature during my interactions with Bob, the hiring process went smoothly. Thus, our family of 3 is slowly moving forward. Bob has completely lost his trustworthiness since our divorce. No matter how good-looking or elite he might be, he's now recognized as a terrible person who can't treat others properly. It seems like no one wants anything to do with him now. A former colleague reached out wanting to talk. Apparently, after Bob recovered from his injuries and returned to work, he was going around saying that I was a terrible woman who abandoned him when he was injured. Despite many people already knowing the real reason for our divorce, I'm astounded at how much he underestimates me. So, I asked my lawyer to send him a formal notice, threatening to sue for defamation if he doesn't correct his story. My friends also shared the real story, and those who were about to believe Bob's version now recognize him as a lying emotional abuser. Well, he seems to still have his job because he's competent, but I wonder how long he can keep it up in such a hostile environment. Right now, I'm not ready to look for someone new, but I want to find someone who truly cares for me next time. I want to show my parents a genuinely happy version of myself. For that day, I'll keep my head held high and continue moving forward.